What happens when a teacher's plan to humiliate a student takes a shocking turn? How does a quiet boy with a hidden genius IQ transform a moment of mockery into a lesson for everyone? Why do we often misjudge people based on appearances? When a strict teacher forces an introverted student to solve an impossibly complex equation, he expects failure and laughter. But as the boy picks up the chalk, the entire class watches in stunned silence. This story is not just about numbers on a board. It is about the unexpected brilliance that can change everything. Stay tuned. In a quiet town at Lincoln High School, a young boy named Ethan sat in the back row of his math class. Ethan was often overlooked. With his messy hair, oversized glasses, and a quiet demeanor, no one knew that behind those glasses lay a mind sharper than anyone could imagine. Ethan's math teacher, Mr. Thompson, was known for his strictness and, unfortunately, his habit of picking on students who struggled. He believed in teaching through embarrassment, a method that often left students anxious and discouraged. One chilly morning, as raindrops tapped against the classroom window, Mr. Thompson decided it was Ethan's turn to be the target. He drew a complex equation on the board, the kind that even advanced students would struggle with. "Ethan," Mr. Thompson called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "since you seem so lost in thought, why do not you come up and solve this?" The class fell silent. Some students whispered, expecting a disaster. Others prepared to laugh. But Ethan stood up calmly. He walked to the board, his face unreadable. Ethan had always been an enigma to his classmates. He was neither the class clown nor the teacher's pet. Instead, he remained somewhere in the shadows, quiet, observant, and to most, utterly forgettable. His clothes were plain, his shoes scuffed, and his backpack frayed at the edges. He never raised his hand, never challenged the teacher, and never drew attention to himself. To the students of Lincoln High School, he was just that kid in the back. But beneath the surface, Ethan's mind was a universe of equations, theories, and possibilities. Numbers danced in his head with the elegance of a symphony, and complex problems unraveled themselves before him as if revealing secrets only he could see. He had always loved the simplicity and logic of mathematics. In a world full of unpredictable emotions and chaotic social dynamics, math was his safe haven. A place where every problem had a solution if you looked hard enough. As Ethan approached the board, Mr. Thompson's lips curled into a thin, satisfied smile. The teacher leaned against his desk, crossing his arms over his chest, fully expecting a spectacle. His method was clear: expose the weak, reinforce dominance, and ensure that students feared failure more than anything else. The equation on the board was monstrous. It sprawled across the white surface, a jungle of integrals, variables, and exponents. The kind of problem that required not just knowledge but strategy, multiple steps, each leading to another challenge. It was a problem designed not for education, but for entrapment. Mr. Thompson had pulled it from an advanced calculus textbook, a chapter far beyond the curriculum. He had used it before in previous years, always with the same result: a fumbling student, a few stuttered guesses, and finally, a lecture on paying attention and studying harder. Ethan's fingers wrapped around the dry erase marker. His grip was steady, his expression placid. He glanced at the equation only briefly, his eyes tracing over the symbols as if they were nothing more than familiar faces in a crowd. His classmates watched with a mixture of pity and anticipation. They had seen this play out before, and they braced themselves for the inevitable. But then, something unexpected happened. Ethan moved. His hand, swift and precise, began to write. The dry erase marker squeaked against the board as he broke down the problem into manageable steps. He did not hesitate. He did not second-guess himself. His process was fluid, almost artistic. The board that once looked chaotic now began to make sense, the wild scribbles transforming into a clean, logical progression of mathematical truth. Whispers filled the room. Students leaned forward in their seats, their earlier amusement replaced with curiosity. Was he solving it? Mr. Thompson's expression shifted. His smirk faded, replaced by a furrowed brow. He took a step closer, his shoes clicking against the tiled floor. He watched as Ethan moved from one step to the next, his calculations flawless, his reasoning sound. Minutes passed. The room remained silent except for the rhythmic sound of the marker. Outside, the rain continued to fall, each drop a quiet reminder of the world beyond the walls of this classroom, where moments like these, small and significant, often went unnoticed. Ethan reached the final line of the equation. He underlined the answer and placed the marker back on the tray. Without a word, he turned to face the class. His expression had not changed. He was still calm, still unreadable. "It is done," he said simply. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, a student in the front row, a girl known for her sharp wit, leaned forward. Is that right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson did not respond. His mind raced as he mentally retraced Ethan's steps, trying to find the flaw, the mistake, the error that would restore his authority. But there was none. The solution was perfect. Slowly, the class began to realize what had just happened. Their expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief to, finally, admiration. The boy they had dismissed, the boy who sat alone at lunch and never joined in on group projects, had just done the impossible. The applause started slowly, one or two claps, hesitant and unsure. But soon it filled the room, a wave of genuine respect. Ethan did not smile. He simply nodded, as if this outcome had been as predictable as the answer to the equation he had just solved. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. Well done, Ethan," he managed, his voice lacking its usual authority. Ethan returned to his seat. The students around him gave him space, not out of fear but out of newfound reverence. He opened his notebook, returned to his sketch of geometric patterns, and allowed the world to move on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the classroom had changed, the students had changed, and Mr. Thompson, for the first time in his career, found himself questioning his own methods. This was no ordinary lesson. This was a story of how quiet brilliance can outshine arrogance, how the underestimated can rise above, and how sometimes the best answers come from the most unexpected places. As the rain continued to fall, Ethan remained in his own world, a world where every problem had a solution, and every solution told a story of its own. As Ethan picked up the chalk, Mr. Thompson folded his arms, ready to enjoy the show. The equation was a nightmare of variables, integrals, and complex numbers. Even the brightest students would have hesitated. But not Ethan. His hand moved swiftly. Numbers and symbols danced on the board as he broke down the equation into simple steps. The students' expressions shifted from amusement to confusion, and then to awe. Mr. Thompson's smirk began to fade. He moved closer, squinting at the board, unable to believe what he was seeing. Ethan had always been the quiet, invisible thread in the fabric of the classroom, a presence noted only when the teacher took attendance. His unassuming nature, combined with his habit of staring off into the distance during lessons, had led many, including Mr. Thompson, to dismiss him as a daydreamer, perhaps even a slacker. But as he stood before the board, a different side of Ethan emerged, one that no one had seen before. The equation sprawled across the board, its complexity undeniable. It was not just difficult. It was a labyrinth of mathematical theory, a beast meant to confuse and humiliate. Mr. Thompson had chosen it specifically for its intricacies, knowing that even the top students would struggle to make sense of it. As Ethan began writing, his process was methodical. He did not rush, but moved with a natural rhythm, as if the solution already existed fully formed in his mind. His eyes, sharp and focused, scanned the equation once, and then he began breaking it down. He started by isolating variables, simplifying expressions, and applying advanced mathematical principles with a confidence that suggested not just knowledge, but mastery. The room remained silent, a vacuum of sound where only the soft squeak of the chalk could be heard. Outside, the rain continued to patter against the windows, a steady backdrop to the unfolding scene. Students who had been slouched in their chairs sat up straighter. Those who had been whispering fell mute. A few leaned forward, their brows knitting together as they tried to follow Ethan's work. Mr. Thompson's amusement slowly transformed into a deep, unsettling confusion. He had expected a mess, scrawled numbers, desperate guesses, and eventually a defeated glance back at the classroom. Instead, he saw clarity. Each line Ethan wrote was precise, every step logically building upon the last. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was as if Ethan was not solving the problem, but merely transcribing an answer he already knew. The teacher took a step closer, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. He uncrossed his arms, his posture losing its earlier confidence. His mind raced through the equation, trying to keep up, but Ethan's methods were swift and, to Mr. Thompson, almost alien. The boy was not just following textbook formulas, he was innovating, finding shortcuts, and revealing patterns that Mr. Thompson had not seen. Ethan's classmates began to exchange glances. Some of the brighter students recognized the techniques he was using: advanced calculus, linear algebra, even elements of discrete mathematics that were far beyond their curriculum. It was as if Ethan had peeled back a curtain, revealing a hidden world of logic and reason that only he could navigate. A bead of sweat appeared on Mr. Thompson's forehead. His reputation was built on control, of his class, of his lessons, of every situation. But now, control was slipping through his fingers. He had wanted to teach Ethan a lesson, but it was becoming clear that the lesson was his to learn. Ethan continued, his movements almost mechanical, yet there was an artistry to it. The once daunting equation was now a clean sequence of steps. He converted integrals with ease, simplified complex numbers, and restructured variables until the entire problem began to shrink, its chaos distilled into a single, elegant answer. Students who had prepared to laugh now sat in stunned silence. They watched as the equation, which had initially seemed like an insurmountable wall, was reduced to a simple truth under Ethan's hand. Some of them began to take notes, scribbling furiously to capture the methods he was using. Others simply stared, their minds struggling to reconcile the quiet boy they knew with the prodigy before them. Mr. Thompson's mouth opened, then closed. He moved even closer, standing just behind Ethan now, his eyes darting over each line of work. His breathing grew shallow, a mix of disbelief and something else: fear. He had miscalculated, not just the problem on the board, but the student standing before him. Finally, with a soft click, Ethan placed the chalk back on the tray. The board, once a storm of variables and symbols, now displayed a perfect, undeniable answer. He turned to face the class, his expression as calm as it had been when he stood up. He did not look at Mr. Thompson, did not seek approval or praise. He simply returned to his seat, a quiet force of nature that had swept through the room and left it forever changed. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the whispers began, soft, incredulous, and filled with a new kind of respect. Students nudged each other, their eyes wide, their voices struggling to find the right words. "Did you see that? How did he do it? Is he some kind of genius?" But Mr. Thompson remained silent. His authority, which had seemed so unshakable, now felt fragile, like glass with a hairline crack. He looked at the board, then at Ethan, and finally at his own hands, which had begun to tremble. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He had tried to make an example of Ethan, but in doing so, he had only exposed his own limitations. This was not just a moment of academic success. It was a shift in power, a rewriting of the classroom's social hierarchy. And at the center of it all stood a boy who had never needed validation, whose genius had spoken for itself in the pure language of mathematics. Ethan sat back in his chair, opened his notebook, and resumed his sketching as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But for everyone else in that room, things would never be quite the same again. In less than 2 minutes, Ethan placed the chalk down. "That is the answer," he said, his voice steady. Mr. Thompson quickly checked the solution with his own notes. He flipped through pages, his hands trembling. It was correct. Every step, every calculation, flawless. The classroom erupted in applause. Students who had once doubted him now looked at Ethan with admiration. The silence that had draped over the room was shattered by the thunderous sound of clapping. Desks creaked as students rose to their feet, unable to contain their awe. The whispers of earlier skepticism had turned into an undeniable chorus of respect. Even those who had been prepared to laugh at Ethan now found themselves cheering him on. Ethan's cheeks flushed slightly, not with arrogance but with the quiet satisfaction of having spoken through his actions. His expression remained calm, his demeanor as composed as it had been when he stood to approach the board. He did not soak in the applause, but instead offered a modest nod to his classmates before returning to his seat. Mr. Thompson's face had drained of color. His fingers, still clutching the notebook, twitched as if struggling to process what had just occurred. The very equation he had chosen as a weapon to humiliate Ethan had become the instrument of his own embarrassment. His eyes moved from the flawless solution on the board to the young boy who had solved it with such ease. "Ethan." Mr. Thompson's voice came out hoarse, a mere whisper against the backdrop of the ongoing applause. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to regain composure. How did you do that?" Ethan looked up, his pencil still in hand as if the question had pulled him from a daydream. "I just broke it down into smaller problems," he replied simply. "The equation looked complex, but once you understand the patterns, it is not as difficult as it seems." Mr. Thompson opened his mouth, perhaps to retort, to reassert his authority, but no words came. His mind, usually sharp and quick, was now a muddled mess. He had always prided himself on being the smartest person in the room, but today, that title had slipped through his grasp. The applause slowly died down, but the energy remained electric. Students exchanged glances, some still in disbelief, others now whispering about Ethan's hidden talent. The balance of power in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. One of the top students, Mia, approached Ethan's desk. Her notebook was clutched to her chest, her expression a blend of admiration and curiosity. "Ethan, would you mind showing me how you did that? I thought I understood calculus, but not like that." Ethan blinked, a bit surprised by the request. "Sure," he said, offering a gentle smile. "It is all about breaking things down. I can show you after class." Mr. Thompson, still at the front of the room, forced a cough. "All right, class," he said, his voice regaining a hint of its usual sharpness. "Settle down. We still have a lesson to complete." But the authority in his tone had diminished. The students, while they obeyed, did so with a newfound sense of independence. The dynamic had changed. They had seen a glimpse of something greater than the rigid structure of the classroom. They had seen potential, not just in Ethan but in themselves. The rest of the lesson dragged on, Mr. Thompson's voice a distant hum as most of the class remained fixated on what had just transpired. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the period, a group of students gathered around Ethan's desk. They peppered him with questions, not just about math, but about how he had learned so much. Ethan answered patiently, explaining that he had always loved puzzles, and that math to him was just another puzzle to solve. He mentioned books he had read, online courses he had taken, and how he practiced solving problems in his spare time. His humility only amplified the respect his peers felt. As the classroom emptied, Mr. Thompson remained behind. His posture slumped as he erased the board. Each swipe of the eraser felt like erasing his own confidence. He had spent years building his identity as the wise, unchallengeable teacher, but today a quiet boy with a genius mind had made him question everything. Ethan, one of the last to leave, paused by the door. "Mr. Thompson?" The teacher turned, his expression weary. "Yes, Ethan?" "Thank you for giving me the chance to solve that problem," Ethan said. His tone was genuine, with no hint of sarcasm. "I know it was not your intention, but it meant a lot to me." Mr. Thompson managed a weak smile. "You are welcome, Ethan." He hesitated, then added, "And well done." Ethan nodded and left, the door swinging shut behind him. Mr. Thompson stood alone in the empty room, a man wrestling with the uncomfortable truth that he had just been taught a lesson by his own student.
Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. It felt symbolic, a reminder that even the darkest moments could give way to light. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, accepting that today was not just a defeat, but an opportunity to learn, to grow, and perhaps to become a better teacher. The story of Ethan's genius spread quickly. By the end of the day, teachers from other classes were discussing it, and students from other grades were asking about the boy who had stunned Mr. Thompson. Ethan's name became synonymous with brilliance, but for him, life continued much the same. He remained humble, helping classmates with their studies and focusing on his own quiet passion for learning. And as for Mr. Thompson, he began to change too. He started approaching his lessons differently, encouraging students to think critically rather than just memorize. He asked more questions and listened more closely to the answers. And every so often, when a student struggled, he would think of Ethan and remind himself that sometimes the quietest voices have the most profound things to say.
In the end, the classroom was not just a place of education, but of transformation for both teacher and student. The lesson that had begun as a ploy to mock had become a pivotal moment of growth, proving that true genius is not just about solving complex equations, but about challenging expectations and inspiring those around you. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. Well done, Ethan. But the damage was done. The teacher who had aimed to mock Ethan ended up showcasing his genius to the entire class. Ethan returned to his seat not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence. From that day on, no one underestimated him again. The whispers among students slowly transformed into stories, and stories into admiration. Ethan's brilliance became a symbol of inspiration. The once quiet, often overlooked boy was now a figure of respect. His peers began to seek his help with assignments, not out of obligation but genuine curiosity. He tutored them with the same patience and humility he had shown on that fateful day. Mr. Thompson, on the other hand, found himself reflecting on his own actions. He realized that he had allowed his biases and frustration to cloud his judgment. His attempt to embarrass Ethan had backfired, and it became a lesson not just for the class but for him as well. He started to change his teaching methods, focusing more on nurturing curiosity rather than asserting his dominance. One afternoon after class, Mr. Thompson approached Ethan while he was gathering his books. "Ethan," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I owe you an apology. What I did was wrong. You showed more grace than I deserved." Ethan looked up, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, sir. I know you were just trying to challenge me." Mr. Thompson nodded, the weight of his guilt lightened by Ethan's forgiveness. "You challenged me too, you know. I learned a lot from you." Their relationship evolved. Mr. Thompson started to offer Ethan advanced resources, recognizing his potential. He encouraged him to participate in math competitions and even introduced him to professors at the nearby university. It was not just redemption for Mr. Thompson, but an acknowledgement of Ethan's potential that he had nearly stifled. The school year went on, and with each passing month, Ethan continued to shine. He won regional math competitions, his name appeared in newsletters, and colleges began to take notice. His journey from the quiet boy in the back of the room to the celebrated math prodigy was nothing short of remarkable. The classroom, too, became a different place. Mr. Thompson's newfound respect for his students fostered a healthier learning environment. He asked more questions, listened to more answers, and encouraged everyone to think freely. The change was palpable, and it started with Ethan's quiet courage. Years later, Ethan stood on the stage of a prestigious university, delivering a lecture to young mathematicians. His words were filled with wisdom, his demeanor still humble. And in the audience, sitting quietly with pride in his eyes, was Mr. Thompson, no longer the teacher who doubted but the mentor who believed. Ethan's story became a testament to the power of perseverance, humility, and the incredible impact of a single moment of courage. He had not only solved a complex equation, but had also transformed a teacher, a classroom, and his own future. And as the lecture hall filled with applause, Ethan once again offered that modest nod, just as he had all those years ago in a small classroom on a rainy day. This story is a reminder that true talent often hides in the most unexpected places. Humility, paired with brilliance, can silence even the harshest critics. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more inspirational tales. Let us know in the comments. Have you ever surprised others with a hidden talent?